Dennis Montenegro had always known that his life would be consumed by the cold, unforgiving walls of prison. At 42, he had already lost count of how many years he had spent there, in an endless cycle of loneliness, pain, and regret. His body, a shadow of what it had been, gave in to hunger and fatigue, while his mind, although numbed by routine, still held fragments of the man he had been before his conviction. He had committed a terrible crime, a murder that had cost him his freedom. But the worst thing wasn't the weight of his sentence. The most devastating thing was the feeling that time no longer made sense. Every dawn, the grey sky rose over the prison yard, and Dennis felt that he was trapped not only between the walls, but also inside his own mind. Everything changed one morning. An unexpected visit, a promise of something beyond the bars that had surrounded him for so long. A group of scientists, led by a stern, serious-looking man, entered Dennis' cell. They weren't there to listen to him, but to offer him something he had never imagined, a chance to escape. The man, who introduced himself as Dr. Keller, explained the concept of the Maximus Ultra Project. It was a revolutionary experiment, an experimental technology capable of transporting a human being's mind to another dimension. The promise was simple but tempting. Dennis could leave prison, not physically, but mentally. His consciousness would be projected into a parallel reality, where he would be able to live outside prison, provided he survived for a year. Dennis listened to everything with empty attention. At one point in his life, the idea of any form of freedom seemed too seductive to resist. He knew that his existence in there was only a matter of time. So when he heard that he could escape, if only with his mind, he didn't think twice. Dr. Keller explained to him that the project was not approved by government officials, but that the participants were chosen because of the need for a test. He didn't mention the scientific details. Dennis wasn't interested. His only thought was, escape. The experiment would take place in a specially designed room. The scientists would attach a metal helmet to his head, which would connect his mind to the device. Dennis wondered for a moment if it was a trap, but soon dismissed it. The fear of physical imprisonment was greater than any other concern. Before he knew it, the helmet was attached and the scientists activated the machine. The process was described as a painless experience, but for Dennis, the sensation was more intense than anything he had ever experienced. He felt his mind being pulled away from his body, like a thread being unraveled. His surroundings began to distort, and the last thing he heard was the constant hum of the machine, which soon disappeared. He woke up in a shapeless place. The floor was dark and damp, and his vision was blurred, as if he had emerged from a dense fog. There were no walls, no ceiling, just a dark immensity that seemed to stretch on forever. But the strangest thing was the silence. There were no sounds of wind, footsteps, or anything. Just emptiness. Dennis tried to move, but his muscles didn't respond in the way he had hoped. He felt light, but not in a good way. It wasn't the lightness of a free body, but the lightness of being out of place, of belonging to nothing. He looked down at his hands, which seemed distorted, as if the very space around them was altering their shape. Dennis' first thought was that the machine had failed. Perhaps the transfer of his mind had been incomplete. Perhaps he was stuck in some kind of limbo. But when he looked up, the truth was even more terrifying. Above him, in what should have been the sky, a multitude of eyes were fixed in his direction. They weren't stars. They weren't celestial figures. They were eyes, huge, moving slowly, watching everything he did. The movement was almost imperceptible, but when he blinked, everything seemed to be adjusting in his vision. They were alive. They were watching. The sensation of being watched was suffocating. He looked around, trying to find an explanation, but everything around him was confusing. The ground beneath his feet was not solid, but liquid, like a dark, viscous substance that moved slowly. He hesitated for a moment, but when he tried to take a step, the ground deformed, as if it were being sucked in. Dennis was in a place where nothing made sense. He felt a growing sense of panic. He forced himself to think, to understand what was happening, but the more he tried, the more his surroundings seemed to distort, expand and contract in a chaotic way. With every step he took, The emptiness stretched out, and the eyes in the sky continued to watch him. What had happened to him? Where was he? How could he escape? There was no answer. Only the deafening silence and the weight of his own doubt. In one last gasp, Dennis tried to scream, but his voice wouldn't come out. He was no longer himself. He was in a place where reason didn't apply. And then, with a shiver running down his spine, Dennis realized what no one had told him. He was no longer in a prison. He was in an infinitely worse place. Dennis tried to understand what was happening, but his hands were shaking as he stared into the void. Panic was a rising wave, unable to be contained. Where was he? He tried somehow to rationalize his surroundings, but nothing made sense. The ground, cold and fluid, seemed to have a strange consistency, as if it were absorbing his movements, making each step more difficult than the last. All around, the silence was absolute, but at the same time oppressive. There was no wind, no sound of life or death, just the sensation of being watched. Like an animal hunted by something invisible, Dennis felt eyes on him, following his every move. He looked up at the sky, where eyes pulsed, but they weren't eyes as he knew them. They were distorted orbs, with dilated pupils that seemed to reflect the very emptiness in which he was immersed. He tried to run, but his feet couldn't move, as if the ground was sticky, resistant to any attempt to escape. The feeling of being trapped intensified with every passing second, and he felt a growing pressure in his mind, as if that reality was trying to devour his memories, disintegrating his identity. That's when he noticed the presence of others. He didn't know how or when, but there they were, figures emerging from the liquid shadows that formed the floor, moving in a strange, fluid way. They didn't speak, but there was a silent communication between them, a connection that Dennis couldn't understand. He took a hesitant step towards one of these figures, and when he did, it turned towards him. The creature had no face, just a distorted, inaccurate human figure. There were no eyes, just deep, black holes where there should once have been something human. Its arms were too long and twitched in impossible directions, as if the bones had been broken and repositioned. She looked at him, but didn't say a word. She just watched. Dennis stepped back, his body moving with an inexplicable sense of revulsion. He felt a strange energy emanating from the creature, something that made him wonder if it still possessed any trace of the humanity it had once had. He swallowed his saliva, trying to gather the strength to speak, but his voice wouldn't come out. Panic gripped him again. Then another figure appeared beside him. It crawled, as if trying to move against gravity, in the liquid that formed the floor. Its skin was pale and repulsive, with a texture as if it had been worn away by some kind of corrosion. However, its eyes were intact, and its gaze met Dennis. The creature, now visibly closer, began to mutter words, but the voice was slurred, distorted, as if it had been extracted from somewhere deep and muffled. Although the words made no sense, there was something in the tone of the voice that made Dennis feel that it was trying to warn him. Time never passes. The door never closes. Dennis felt a shiver run down his spine. He tried to move away, but the floor held him back. He wasn't in a normal place. He wasn't in a physical place. He was trapped in a reality where time didn't exist and the laws of physics were manipulated. But what terrified him most was the fact that those figures, those creatures, were not there by chance. They were, like him, connected to the same destiny. Slowly he moved away, trying to dispel the feeling of despair that was building up in his chest. But the more he tried, the more the space around him stretched out. He couldn't tell whether he was walking forwards or backwards. The feeling of disorientation was absolute. Every movement he made felt like he was always in the same place. The environment didn't change. He sat down, exhausted, not knowing what to do, with no answers. The air was heavy, as if the dimension itself was suffocating his mind. He tried to close his eyes, but when he opened them again, the figures were closer. They were moving with no clear purpose, but they were getting closer. They didn't speak, but their presence was dominant, suffocating. Dennis didn't know how long it was before a feeling of strangeness settled in his mind. Those beings, those prisoners, They weren't there by chance. They were trapped just like him. He was in a prison, but no ordinary prison. He was in a prison where time didn't exist and where any attempt to escape was futile. The truth began to form in his mind in a bewildering way. He wasn't in a physical place. He wasn't just stuck in a cell. He was in an interdimensional dimension, where his memories, his identity, were being destroyed, where space had no limits. And worse, he knew that once he was there would be no way out. That was the most terrifying truth. He wasn't in control. And perhaps he never had been. Dennis continued to wander through the dark vastness of that strange dimension, feeling more and more out of place. The ground, which seemed liquid and sticky, dragged slowly under his feet, resisting every step he tried to take. He had no idea how long it had been since the machine had transported him to that place. But the mental strain was beginning to weigh him down. He tried to concentrate, but the feeling of being outside his own mind persisted, an unbearable distortion. The presence of the other creatures was constant. They followed him from a distance, appearing and disappearing like shadows, their deformed figures almost indistinguishable from the very dark mist that hung over the space. But there was something different about that night, or what Dennis thought was night. The air was thicker, and the creatures seemed more aggressive, more alert. They were getting closer. Dennis could no longer distinguish what was real. Every step he took was towards an endless abyss, where there was no sound, no reference to orient himself. He felt his own mind fragmenting, losing control of his own thoughts, his own identity. He no longer knew who he was. He no longer knew if the essence that remained of him still belonged to the man who had once committed a crime and been convicted. It was then that he encountered another being. He suddenly appeared out of an even thicker mist, a human figure who, unlike the others, seemed to have a more defined countenance. He wasn't deformed or distorted, but his presence still exuded something morbid, something Dennis couldn't understand. He approached slowly, his eyes fixed on Dennis, with an expression that conveyed neither empathy nor fear. The being, who introduced himself as Raymond, said that he was one of the many prisoners in the project, an experiment that preceded Dennis. Raymond's explanation was a mixture of despair and resigned acceptance. He was talking about the true nature of Project Maximus Ultra. It wasn't an experiment to free prisoners, as had been promised, but a way of testing them. The government didn't want people out of prison. They wanted to know how far a human mind could be taken before it broke down completely. Raymond, unlike Dennis, had already accepted his condition. He explained how the dimension they were in wasn't simply a prison. It was something beyond that. A place where time and space bent and twisted in ways that were impossible to understand. Where the line between life and death became irrelevant, and the prisoners were condemned to wander in an eternity of mental fragmentation. As Raymond spoke, Dennis tried to process the words, but his brain didn't respond as it should. He felt enveloped in a heavy fog, as if Raymond's words were not clearly understood, but absorbed into an empty space inside his mind. He looked at Raymond, trying to find some trace of humanity, but what he saw was only a shadow of himself, someone who had lost himself in that dimension, just as Dennis was about to lose himself. "They've got us, Dennis. All of us. There's no way out. There's no more hope," Raymond said in an empty voice, as if it were just a fact, an incontestable truth. Dennis took a step back. The idea of acceptance seemed alien to him. He still had hope, however faint, of escape. He didn't want to believe that he was trapped in a place where the only certainty was eternal damnation. The pain of realizing that he no longer had control over his existence was suffocating. But when Dennis looked at his surroundings, something made his stomach turn. In the distance, he could see more prisoners emerging from the darkness. More figures crawling through the shadows, dragging their deformed bodies, with no clear faces or identities. They were there, all of them, and Dennis realized that wherever he looked, there were more. More beings like him, like Raymond, like prisoners. Over time, he began to understand that the dimension was meant to be an endless prison. There was no room for freedom. There was no way to escape. There was nothing but eternity. You start to realize too late, Dennis. You start to realize when everything is already lost, said Raymond, as a new creature approached. Dennis, now directionless, started walking, even though he knew there was nowhere to go. The creatures were watching him, always watching. There was no way out, but Dennis kept trying, unconcerned. He tried to cling to the idea that he could still find a way out, but deep down he knew there was no hope. In his mind, he began to hear a voice. Not a human voice, but a voice that resonated in his conscience. A voice that told him he wasn't in an ordinary prison, but in something beyond a simple dimension. Something built to twist and turn the human mind until it was no longer able to comprehend what was real. He was no longer in a physical place. He was inside a test, a cruel experiment. And most frightening of all, he was beginning to become like the others. Dennis looked at the prisoners, at the deformed creatures around him, and saw what he had feared. He was beginning to feel like them. Every step he took, every thought he tried to order, he felt his own identity fading away. He began to understand the truth behind the Maximus Ultra project. Here, in the interdimensional prison, no one could escape. No matter what they tried. They were trapped forever. Dennis could no longer tell if the days were passing or if the very idea of time had dissolved. The dimension in which he was trapped seemed cyclical, with no beginning, middle, or end. Nothing changed, and at the same time, everything was constantly changing. The deformed figures, the prisoners and the observing creatures were always there, unchanging and distant, but somehow still present, like ghosts wandering through a space beyond the reach of human comprehension. His mind, already fragmented, struggled against the certainty that he was lost. He looked at the other prisoners, those who had succumbed to the vortex of madness, and began to realize that the distance between him and them was shrinking. He tried to convince himself that there was still something human inside him, that he could still save himself, but the echoes of Raymond, of his whispers and warnings, reverberated inside him. There's no escape, Dennis. There's nothing. Raymond's voice always sounded like a sentence, and gradually Dennis felt the words seeping into his very soul, like an incurable disease. The space around him seemed to float, a void of possibilities where the boundaries of the real and the unreal blurred. He felt that he was beginning to fall apart, that his own identity was disappearing. He was no longer a man, but a shadow of who he had been, a distorted copy. And with every lost thought, he felt the approach of what he feared. He was becoming one of the creatures. It was then, in the midst of the mist that enveloped him, that something changed. Not physically, but inside him. As if a distant memory had been revived. He remembered the initial proposal, the scientist's promise, a chance to escape. Those words had come like a beacon of hope in the darkness. But the truth, as terrible as it was, began to reveal itself. The machine that had transported him to that dimension was not just a mind transfer device. It was a device of destruction. What the scientists wanted to test was not the resistance of the human mind to psychological pressure. What they wanted to test was how the human mind corrodes under a total lack of control. They weren't looking for an escape. They were looking for a break. Dennis finally realized that the Maximus Ultra project was not intended to save or free the prisoners. They were there to be disintegrated. The dimension was not a place where they could escape, but a laboratory where their consciousnesses would be deconstructed, fragmented, and eventually erased. He wasn't in a prison, but in a field of experimentation where reality itself fell apart, and the prisoners slowly became nothing. Dennis, in a desperate impulse, looked at the others around him. Some were lying on the ground, like walking corpses, their minds already completely consumed by the eternity of the dimension. Others were still trying to walk, like lost shadows, wandering aimlessly, their eyes empty of any hope. And then, with a growing sense of terror, he realized that there was no one left like him. Everyone was getting lost, one by one, until eventually there would be nothing left. But the worst part was yet to come. In the center of the darkness, a stronger, more definitive presence began to form. It was like an invisible force, something that was constantly around him, but which he hadn't noticed until that moment. At first, it seemed like just a sensation, the growing weight of emptiness, the idea that something was getting closer. But then, as Dennis began to realize it, he saw what was really in front of him. It was the end of everything. The reality around him began to distort in an even more grotesque way, as if space were literally folding in on itself. The central figure of the dimension, a presence of pure darkness and desolation, appeared before Dennis. It wasn't a creature, it wasn't an entity, but something else, the very essence of what he was trapped in. The formless, meaningless reality that was slowly consuming him. Dennis tried to resist, tried to fight against that force, but he already knew. There was no escape. He was in an endless cycle, in a prison where time didn't exist and where death wasn't an escape, but a transition to a new kind of torment. And as he began to be absorbed by that darkness, he felt his consciousness shatter, like glass breaking under unbearable pressure. He was no longer Dennis Montenegro. He was no longer anyone. He became part of the void, part of the experience of destruction that he and the other prisoners had been forced to live through. In the end, the only thing that remained was darkness. An endless darkness, where the concept of identity, time and space no longer meant anything. Where the prisoners of the Maximus Ultra project became just echoes, memories of a failed experiment. Dennis Montenegro had been forgotten. Not through any fault of his own, but because he had never really existed in that place. He was just a broken mind, dissolved in an endless abyss. Share your opinion in the comments and tell us what you think about this prison created by these mad scientists. If you liked this story and want to explore more stories like this, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. The unknown still has a lot to teach us.